مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. معكم مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. في رأي الكثيرين سياسة الرئيس أوباما الخارجية في مأزق. ينتقد الأصدقاء الافتقار إلى الزعامة وغياب الاستراتيجية. يبدي الخصوم خوفا قليلا واحتراما أقل. تقول استطلاعات الرأي العام أن الشعب الأمريكي ربما يدعم بنود معينة في أجندة السياسة الخارجية، ولكنهم ما يزالون يؤمنون أن الرئيس ضعيف. جعل الوضع أسوأ بزياراته الأخيرة إلى آسيا، والتي أقر فيها بأنه لا يؤلق أمالا كبيرة على السياسة الخارجية، ويركز على تجنب الأخطاء وليس تحقيق نجاحات باهرة. لتغيير المسار ألقى الرئيس خطابا هاما في الأكاديمية العسكرية الأميركية ويست بوينت. كانت الفكرة من ورائه إعادة تشكيل ملامح السياسة الخارجية الأمريكية وبث قدر من الانضباط والاستراتيجية في الجدل العام حول دور أمريكا في العالم، من الحرب ضد الإرهاب إلى المأساة في سوريا إلى تحدي أوكرانيا. كانت الفكرة من ورائه إعادة تشكيل ملامح السياسة الخارجية الأمريكية وبث قدر من الانضباط والاستراتيجية في الجدل العام حول دور أمريكا في العالم، من الحرب ضد الإرهاب إلى المأساة في سوريا إلى تحدي أوكرانيا. حاول الرئيس أن يصحح الانطباع بتراجع دور أمريكا وعجزها أو إحجامها عن قيادة العالم الحر. هل نجح؟ كيف تبدو استراتيجياته الجديدة؟ هل ستغير الطريقة التي ينظر بها الأصدقاء والخصوم إلى بلدنا؟ لمناقشة هذه الموضوعات يسرني أن أرحب من جديد باللجنة المكونة من خبيري السياسة الخارجية دينيس روس ووان زراتي. Welcome back to Dakhil, Washington. We're sitting with our panel of foreign policy experts to discuss the rebranding of foreign policy in the Obama administration. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us again.
My pleasure.
The president and his team are recharacterizing, rebranding, reissuing foreign policy for the administration. Why?
Dennis?
Well, I think there's probably a couple of reasons right now. I think one is that there's an increasing concern about how we are seen internationally. And I think the president's trip to Asia, while I think the specifics of it went reasonably well, I think the imagery was somehow the U.S. is constantly sort of reacting to things, isn't seen as shaping the landscape internationally as much as perhaps we might once have. And in the face of what the Russians have done in Crimea and Ukraine, I think in the face as well of what seems to be genuine concerns about what the U.S. is getting done or not doing in the Middle East, I think there's a feeling that it's important right now for the United States to put a different foot forward. I suspect that the president, when he speaks about these things, is increasingly going to try to frame things in a way that makes it clear the U.S. is going to remain engaged. We are not withdrawing. The role of the United States, while we will share responsibilities with others, we still understand that we have leadership responsibilities, and that the choices we face in being involved are not about resolving problems in their entirety or doing nothing. We need to have something that makes it clear that we can affect things, and what we're going to do is act in a way that makes us more assertive on the one hand, but also, I think, more enduring in terms of what we do on the other.
Juan, Dennis opened with a reference to the Asia trip, which is in some sense connected to the president's line about preferring to hit singles and doubles and not going for the fences, to use the baseball metaphor. Is that an image that needs to be repaired?
I think so, and I think part of it is to further the baseball analogy for those viewers who know baseball. It appears we're not even swinging at the ball. You're right. There's a sense that we're not only reactive, but may not even be present internationally, especially on the core key issues, whether it's Russia and Ukraine, whether it's Syria, whether it's Chinese aggression and policies in the South China Sea. There's a sense of a lack of American purpose and presence. And I think this speech is intended, I think, to articulate, both for the Obama critics as well as a foreign audience, what our foreign policy really is about. To Dennis's point, how will the U.S. demonstrate its presence and power moving forward, especially given the multitude of challenges? And I think that's really what the president's going to try to do. But as we've said before on other programs, I think the proof is in the pudding. The question will not be so much what does he say, but what does the U.S. do? What do we do in some of these hard issues and problems? What do we do with respect to Egypt and the transition there, the problems emerging in Libya, the continuing festering conflict in Syria? What do our friends and allies, as well as our adversaries and competitors, see as American presence and power? And I think that's ultimately the question that will be posed to the administration, less about what's in a speech.
Dennis, we're going to get to some of the specific critiques that Juan mentioned, but in general, isn't giving a speech itself part of the critique? I mean, the critique is that it's a lot of talk, but not a lot of action?
Well, I think, yes. Part of the problem right now is that there's a perception of passivity, retrenchment, and no speech can satisfy that, because all it may do is once again highlight the gap between what is being said and what is being done. That said, I think one of the things that the administration feels right now is that there isn't more of an explanation about what the U.S. purpose is right now internationally. And it's, in a sense, it's taking place against the backdrop of what is perceived as the wariness of the American public, the weariness of the American public, the reluctance to be involved in anything that might smack of conflict. And I think there's an effort to try to tell a story right now that puts in perspective. The U.S. has a role to play internationally that nobody else can play. When the U.S. doesn't play that role, vacuums get created. They get filled by the worst kinds of forces. And I think part of what is motivating this speech is not just to allow the president to address that kind of a concern, but to explain more clearly what our purposes are right now, what we will try to do. I don't expect this to be a speech where he will somehow say, we're going to solve all problems. I don't expect him to suddenly say that there are places where we can see, we can transform the reality. But I do expect it to be, in a sense, more assertive, more outlining that the U.S. role is in many respects indispensable, and that the role of power in American foreign policy has not disappeared. Yes, there's such a thing as soft power. Yes, there's such a thing as smart power. But the U.S. will, in fact, stand up for its friends and its interests, and it's prepared to use all the instrumentalities of power in trying to pursue not just what our interests, but also a reality that when the U.S. is perceived to be withdrawing, we see others become more active and not in a favorable way.
So, Juan, as somebody who is, shall we say, a friendly critic of the administration's foreign policy, in general, is there anything that the president could say that would mollify your critique?
I think Dennis is right. If he sets forth a vision for what American power and presence should be moving forward, I think that's a step in the right direction. Because part of my criticism of the administration is that so much of its foreign policy has been defined by its opposition to what came before, or at least the caricature of what came before. And I think that has affected the creativeness of the foreign policy that could be generated in the Obama administration. The fact that in some ways they've overlearned the lessons of the Bush era, and they have taken as their policy, I think, a policy of caution and inaction to counter what they perceive to be over-aggressive use of American power and action during the Bush administration. And so I think the pendulum has swung too far, and I think if the president demonstrates that he's thinking forward about what American power and influence should be, I think that's helpful. The problem, I think, is he's had 6 years of rhetoric that has really tried to downplay the ability of the United States to influence around the world, in part to make the argument that there has to be a division of labor, that the U.S. can't be all things to all people, isn't going to be the world's policeman. That's understandable. But I think in downplaying America's ability to influence and creating a straw man argument that that influence is either boots on the ground and military power or nothing, in some ways he's constrained both the imagination and the construct of what the foreign policy can be. So I think if he breaks through that, that's actually something positive that he can do. But at the end of the day, again, he's going to have to announce some policies and actions that will set forth what that looks like. And at a time when the U.S. appears to be withdrawing, including from Afghanistan, that's a difficult narrative to lay out if we appear to be withdrawing, but also articulating a forward-looking foreign policy. That's tough.
Okay, when we come back, I'm going to ask Juan to address this and also to focus on the question of American leadership abroad and what the president can say about that. Again, our panel of foreign policy experts includes Juan Zarate. Juan is the Senior Advisor to the Center for Strategic and International Studies and the Senior National Security Consultant and Analyst for CBS News. One of our nation's leading counterterrorism and national security experts, Juan served in the administration of President George W. Bush as Assistant to the President and Deputy National Security Advisor. An attorney by training, he was the first ever Assistant Secretary of the Treasury for terrorist financing and financial crimes. His experience is the subject of a new book, Treasury's War, The Unleashing of a New Era of Financial Warfare. Sitting next to Juan is my colleague Dennis Ross, the counselor to the Washington Institute, which he rejoined after 3 years' service in the Obama administration, first in the State Department and then as Senior Director for the Central Region on the staff of the National Security Council. Dennis has a quarter-century experience at high levels of government, including White House tours in the Reagan, Bush, and Clinton administrations, and service as the president's special envoy for Middle East peace. So, Juan, American leadership. What can the president say that convinces people in America and around the world that he is the leader that the world hopes he would be?
Well, I think it has to be two things, really. It has to be not just what he says, but policy actions that follow from the speech. And I think that's ultimately going to be the test of the effectiveness of the speech. But I think the message has to be that the U.S. has an inherent interest in its security relationships around the world, that we are not seeing a period of retrenchment of American power, an inward-looking policy that will leave our allies to fend for themselves and will leave our enemies sort of free rein to operate around the world. And so I think he has to not only express that, but then follow with policy actions, or at least announce a couple of things that will be examples of how the U.S. will actually do that. And I think he does that in Afghanistan by demonstrating we are going to have troops left behind. He may do something vis-a-vis Syria with respect to further support of rebels that the U.S. has been backing. And so there has to be something that demonstrates that the U.S. is going to actually be present, and it can't simply be about the speech.
And Dennis, the last of these sort of three overarching critiques is, in my view, a certain indifference or an uneven quality to dealing with atrocity. I find it ironic, for example, that right now we have more American boots on the ground in Nigeria to assist with the horrific kidnapping of 200 girls than in Syria, where 160,000 have been killed. How do you balance this, and is this even on the agenda of the White House?
I don't know that it's on the agenda of the White House, because I think in some ways the concern about getting sucked into conflicts where there's no end is still a kind of predominant theme that characterizes the approach. But I do think we're seeing what is the beginning of an evolution, at least, maybe not a transformation, but an evolution. And I think the way to think about it is twofold. One, I think the administration up until now has been shaped largely by its concern about the costs of action and less by the costs of inaction. And I think the extent to which it begins to address this question of when you're not active, what happens? What are the risks of not being active, not just what are the risks of being active? That's element number one. I think there's another key here as well, and that is to not position ourselves so that the only choices are doing everything or doing nothing, because there are many options in between. Samantha Power, when she spoke at the Holocaust Museum, made this point, and it seems to be registering more and more with the administration, and I suspect that will be something that emerges not only in terms of what the president does now and says, but also some areas where there'll be manifestations of it. I do think Syria may well be a manifestation of it, and I think that is overdue.
I do think this is an important point. It relates to your earlier question, Rob, about the president's devotion to international principles and norms. Because I think there's a deep devotion to the notion that this is incredibly important to have international norms that are spelled out, that are bought into by the international community, and ultimately defended and propagated, being as central to American power and influence. I think one of the reasons you have some of this evolution, and what you may see in this speech, is the fact that you have those norms themselves being undermined by our inaction. And so it's not just short-term American interests or threats to American power that are at play. That's certainly on the table. But you also have the very principles, territorial sovereignty being challenged by the Russians in the Ukraine, China in the South China Sea. The never again principles being challenged in the context of Syria or the Central African Republic. The use of WMD, having that line crossed in Syria, maybe now yet again with the use of chlorine gas. The threat of proliferation, not just with North Korea and Iran, but perhaps even states in the Middle East. And so the very principles that the administration is so devoted to, the international norms, are actually being undermined because you don't have an American presence that's able to shape the environment. So to my mind, that's something that's core and fundamental to the thinking of this president. And it's in part why I think you've had, in part, this evolution, hopefully, of thinking on the part of the White House.
So let's talk specifics now in terms of what initiatives do you think, as we look out at the next 2.5 years of the balance of the Obama administration, new ideas? I mean, we know that the trade deal in Asia looks like it's unlikely to reach fruition. Iran nuclear talks, we'll see. Are there other arenas of big new ideas that we might expect? Juan?
I think with respect to Asia, I think there's going to continue to be a push on the trade deal. As we've talked about before, these trade deals are hard to negotiate, especially when you're talking about multiple parties, big economies, lots of different interests. So I think they're going to continue to push behind the scenes and perhaps not make it such a showcase, but ultimately, hopefully, deliver maybe even for the next administration. But I think with respect to China, I think you're going to see some bigger steps. I think the administration very much wants to make real the pivot to Asia. Part of that is beginning to push back a bit on China. And you've seen glimmers of that already with the indictments of Chinese officials for cyber espionage, I think being the first salvo in an attempt to push back on Chinese aggression on the internet. You're going to see maybe additional maneuvers of the type and announcements that we saw at the president's visit in Asia to talk about military cooperation with countries like the Philippines and Vietnam. So I think in Asia you're going to see more running room to develop more creativity, both to push back on China and to create some new alliances. I think you're also going to have to see some action on Syria, because Syria is such a festering wound, whether from a national security perspective, right in the heart of the Levant, or from the humanitarian perspective. There are just so many problems emerging from Syria that we're going to have to do more. What that looks like, I'm not sure, but we're going to have to do something differently.
Dennis, big new initiatives?
You know, I feel very much like Juan that you'll probably see a greater level of activity to deal with the Chinese in both the East and South China Seas. That this is a good example, by the way, of establishing international norms, that they don't just simply get to claim all of these territorial areas, particularly where the mineral resources are so significant. I also think Syria. I have felt for some time that if the administration didn't do anything differently from what it was doing, that before the end of the term you would see drone strikes against some of the territory that is associated with the jihadis within Syria. I think given that increasing likelihood that there's an understanding that our interests are more directly engaged, we will do more. Now, whether it would be as much as I would like to see, for example, I'd like to see something done in terms of creating real humanitarian corridors within Syria. If you want to establish international norms, you want to take a Security Council resolution that was adopted about the movement, the unencumbered movement of humanitarian assistance into Syria, this would be a good place to start. And it would relate as well to what the administration says it wants with regard to Syria, which is a political outcome. Every time you say there's no military solution, it implies that there's nothing to be done militarily. But that's not the case. If you actually want to produce a political settlement there, you have to change the balance of power on the ground. And you won't do that except by becoming more active in terms of lethal assistance, and at some point even being prepared to do more with regard to those who are blocking the access of humanitarian assistance.
So I'm hearing you both say China and Syria as areas of greater action, and neither saying Ukraine, Eastern Europe, pushing back against Russia. I'm going to have to stop there, and we'll come back and we'll see what the president really does in our next discussion on the state of American foreign policy. Thank you. بهذا نصل إلى نهاية هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إذا كانت لديكم أي استفسارات أو تعليقات حول هذه الحلقة، وخاصة حول فعالية السياسة الخارجية الأمريكية، أرجو أن تتصلوا بي مباشرة على عنوان البريد الإلكتروني التالي insidewashington@alhura.com. معكم روبرت ساتلوف، شكرا لكم وإلى اللقاء.